So now I pass on to our next speaker, who is Ahmed Kabel, who teaches at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Akhawayn University in Eastern Morocco. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I first want to apologize about my voice. You can blame it on the it's an Islamophobic attack of Parisian weather. So my presentation, as you can see from the title, is the neo-white man's burden, or when Islamophobia meets neoliberalism. I want first of all to start with a brief overview of what Islamophobia is and what it may not be. Islamophobia is not exclusively a phenomenological entity that exists in the minds of people. It's not exclusively about a social psychology of prejudice or bias or ignorance. It's not only a matter of it's not a psychopathology of fear or hatred, but it's far more than that. It's a systemic entity that is a reflection of institutionalized. It is an institutionalized form of racism that is deeply embedded in a particular view of the culturalist nation state. What I'm more particularly interested in my presentation is to look at Islamophobia as principally as an ideological infrastructure for instituting a new racialized global order. And what we've seen in the interesting various presentations in this conference is Islamophobia being thought from multiple subject positions. And I want to think Islamophobia through my own subject position as a subject of neoliberal Anglo-American empire. So this is precisely my vantage point, or the vantage point I'm using to think Islamophobia. And I want to specifically focus on the intersection of three hegemonic regimes: Islamophobia, neoliberalism, and Anglo-American educational imperialism in the Muslim world, in the context of the neo-white man's burden. I want, first of all, before I go on to the analysis, I want to emphasize the fact that neoliberalism is not exclusively an economic orthodoxy. It's far beyond that. Neoliberalism is a social program, and it is a project geared towards producing a new version of the human. So I want to look at neoliberalism from this broader perspective. It's not just economic restructuring, privatization, and so on and so forth, but it's far more than that. Okay? There are two processes involved in the neoliberal project. There's the neoliberalization from above, economic restructuring, and so on and so forth, but there is also neoliberalization from the bottom, from below. And these two projects are co-constructed as a hegemonic program. I want specifically to look at what I call the Islamophobic neoliberal educational complex, and how these three regimes' discourses intersect in politics in the Middle East. And is one major fulcrum in the war. In fact, it's a war of terror, not a war on terror. Language is very much constitutive of how we see the world. So when we sanitize language, language colludes in the construction and reproduction of oppression. So it's a war of terror, not necessarily a war on terror. So in this global war of terror, the war for hearts and minds is crucial. And as Paul Salim here, the director of the Carnegie Middle East Center says, he says that the struggle for the future of the Arab and Muslim worlds that is being fought now will be won or lost, not on the battlefield, but in the classroom. And I can assure you that Paul Salim was simply echoing the view from Washington. So the Islamophobic neoliberal educational complex rests around a number of projects, interrelated projects. And you can see these are snapshots taken from high-level policy planning documentation. And there is a huge genre, a huge corpus of documentation reflecting these tight connections between Islamophobia, neoliberalism, and educational imperialism. And I have 5 or 6 excerpts here. The education deficit, according to the Committee on Foreign Relations. This is a document that was drafted by Obama, John Kerry, Chuck Hagel, and a lot of other prominent figures in the current administration back in 2005. And it says that one of the major problems for terrorism in the region is an educational deficit. And Council on Foreign Relations document written less than 2 months after 9/11 argue, or at least calls for taking education out of the hands of the fundamentalists and help extirpate the anti-American and anti-Semitic bile that plagues their educational systems. And this should, the solution for this is actually, or the education is the best hope for turning young people, namely young Muslims, away from violence and extremism. And this leads to Bush's utopia of a free market, of a global free market. So one, as you can see here, one fundamental focus or trope in the war on terror, or of terror, is to ignite a new era of global economic growth through free markets and free trade. So what we can see here is basically the tight connections between 3 hegemonic discourses: Islamophobia, neoliberalism, and educational imperialism. One of the major principles of this war for hearts and minds is to use educational systems as an instrument for engaging in a new civilizing mission. It's actually the creation of a new Muslim being who is imbued with a number of liberal values, as opposed to the culture of intolerance, bias, bigotry, and anti-Semitism that plagues educational systems in the Middle East. There are 3 major elements here taken from different reports, and they all focus on the fact that the educational system, especially in Saudi Arabia and in Pakistan, are plagued with intolerance, bigotry, and anti-Semitism. What's interesting is not just these things. What's interesting, in fact, is the solutions that are proposed to fight this culture of intolerance, bigotry, and anti-Semitism. And secondly, what these reports reflect in terms of institutionalized racism. These reports completely remove from view the intensive militarization of educational systems in Israel. Gore argues that Israeli education prepares children to accept war as a natural factor of life. Pel Dilhanan, a distinguished educational researcher in Israel, concludes in one of her studies that Israeli mainstream school books implicitly legitimate the killing of Palestinians as an effective tool to preserve a secure Jewish state with a Jewish majority, and that this legitimation prepares Israeli youth to be good soldiers and to carry on the practices of occupation in the Palestinian occupied territories. The reason why this is significant is this is reflective of a certain deeply entrenched institutionalized racism. The selective outrage, the selective attention being directed to intolerance, to bigotry, to anti-Semitism in curricula in the Middle East, and the complete removal from view of these realities is indicative of deep deep-seated, institutionalized Islamophobic racism. Of course, one can also talk about the increasing militarization of education in the United States, and also the gradual taking over of the educational agenda in the United States by the right wing, which breeds a culture of intolerance, not to speak of the broader context of intolerance outside schools. To give you a sense of how these neo-colonial designs have so much passion for inculcating democratic values and values of tolerance, I want to show you an excerpt here taken from a textbook. The speed of a Kalashnikov bullet is 800 meters per second. If a Russian is at a distance of 3,200 meters from a mujahid, and that mujahid aims at the Russian's head, calculate how many seconds it will take for the bullet to strike the Russian in the forehead. I don't want to embarrass you, but this was part of a 4th grade mathematics textbook, produced by the University of Nebraska for Afghani children during the Cold War. And the University of Nebraska produced these textbooks under a grant from USAID, from the American people, exclamation mark. Now, one major focus, again, on the war, in the war for hearts and minds, and how it intersects with Islamophobia and neoliberalism and educational imperialism, is using Islamophobia as an ideological mainstay for the commodification of education in the Middle East. There has been a relentless attack on education as an institution for producing critical citizens who are organically connected to their own local environments and who are responsible for thinking ways of independent development. So there has been a constant process of marketization and commodification of education in the Middle East as a way to fight extremism, terrorism, and radicalization. And this is really what's interesting to see in these interconnections. So education is being used as a tool to commodify learning and education in general as an instrument for fighting terrorism, radicalization, and extremism. There's focus on 3 major areas. Focus on skills, basically the narrowing down, a drastic reduction of education to producing students with marketable skills, with skills that would qualify them for the job market. And there's an overemphasis on not the knowledge economy, producing people who are able to work in the information technology sector, people who are equipped with the skills necessary for them to cope with the challenges of a knowledge economy. This is a very radical departure in these educational systems after 9/11. And a lot of policy documents, actually high-level policy documents, pushing countries in the region to institute more commodified versions of education. This is a quote taken from a Council on Foreign Relations report, which, as you can see here, the educational systems in the Middle East actually produce unthinking individuals. What they need to teach them is to civilize them through marketable skills. Islamophobia as Disneyfication through Sesame Street. This Sesame Street was most of you might know, is the educational children's series. It was financed by USAID to offer fun education for Pakistani children in order to stall descent into religious conservatism and economic stagnation. So we'll all be saved if you watch Sesame Street. In fact, fun education will have the capacity to encourage tolerance, which is so key to what we're trying to do here. This is Larry Dolan, Education Office Director of USAID Pakistan. And Sesame Street will help in the process of the greater secularization of Pakistan's various education institutions, not just to madrasas, and ultimately to de-Islamize the educational system which is US official goal according to a RAND insider. Now, Islamophobia as civilicide. This gigantic project of civilizational genocide is being played out now in Iraq. And it's a broad project of civilicide, historicide, culturicide, ecocide, epistemicide, linguicide. It's a multi-layered project of civilizational genocide, the destruction of collective memory, the destruction of culture, the destruction of the educational system, the destruction of epistemologies, local epistemologies, the destruction of the viability and vitality of local languages, namely Arabic. In fact, the Iraqi experiment is an experiment in what Wolfowitz called nation ending. The whole experiment in Iraq is an experiment in nation ending, not nation building. And the whole destructive outcome of it provided the opportunity for a clean start to overhaul the entire educational system and to establish liberal arts colleges and American universities, which was part of the very initial planning of the complete neoliberalization of Iraq. An overhaul of the educational system was one of the three major pillars, in addition to the complete overhaul of the legal infrastructure and the political landscape. And as you can see here, Major Rolf Peters, writing in the flagship journal of the U.S. Army War College, the de facto role of U.S. Armed Forces will be to keep the world safe for our economy and open to our cultural assault. Those ends will do a fair amount of killing. Now, lastly, Islamophobia and how it connects within this broader context of educational imperialism, how Islamophobia connects with the politics of the anglicized, Americanized university and the politics of knowledge. You have a point of praise here for Qatar, which has been willing to allow American universities to actually establish their own campuses, and how that is a central element in this Islamophobic neoliberal educational complex idea. Glasser crows over the fact that Qatar has been able to institute less Islam and more English. And this implies the civilizing effects of adopting English as a language of instruction in higher education institutions, and the parallel implication that Arabic is a language that foments terrorism and radicalization and so on and so forth. What's interesting to look at here is the fact that languages themselves have been neoliberalized, in the sense that languages receive market price tags, that languages are important or unimportant as a result of the simple fact or as a function of their value in the market. And languages should not be assigned price tags. Languages are so important to who people are, how they live, their lived experiences, their sense of history, their sense of being, and so on and so forth. I want to tell you a brief joke. There was this Native American elder at a conference in North America. He was talking about the importance of speaking native languages for cultural identities, for cultural survival, resistance, and so on and so forth. So he told the audience that he wanted to speak his indigenous language because when he goes to heaven, he wants to communicate with people from his own community. And then one skeptic from the audience asked, "What if you go to hell?" And I said, "Don't worry, I speak English." So those of you who those of you who are planning to go to hell, you have to learn English, or you have to immediately book the service of a translator. So the anglicized Americanized university is a hub in the Middle East, in this context of Islamophobia, neoliberalism, educational imperialism, is a hub for the production of neo-imperial and neo-colonial knowledge. And it also a factor in the naturalization of the Western canon as a universal norm. It is also significant in terms of creating epistemic racism and epistemicide. The structural hierarchization of different kinds of knowledge, of different kinds of epistemologies is so central to the functioning of the anglicized, Americanized University, which is a significant element of this toxic combination of Islamophobia, neoliberalism, and educational imperialism. It also leads to alienated and disembedded knowledge. Knowledge that is not, this completely disconnected from its own organic habitat. Commodification, I already talked about that. It leads to some sort of academic and knowledge feudalism. Now, Tony Blair back in 2004, now after all this civilicide that I talked about, said in years to come, people here in this country, meaning Iraq, and I believe around the world, will look back on what you have done. He was addressing US Marines, by the way. So we'll look back on what you have done and give thanks and recognize that they owe you a tremendous debt of gratitude. So please do not save us. This is an example of Western benevolence, according to distinguished British historian Mark Curtis, that since 1945, more than occasionally deviating from promotion of peace, democracy, human rights, and economic development, British and US foreign policy has been systematically opposed to them. I think the 1945 is a very narrow scope. And this is coda from the great Eduardo Galeano. These professions of noble intent should be contrasted to the realities of oppression in the context of the connection that I've tried to make. So according to Eduardo Galeano, in 1937, one major actor in Anglo-American imperialism, John Rockefeller, owner of the world, king of oil, founder of Standard Oil Company, passed away. He had lived for nearly a century. The autopsy found not a single moral principle. Thank you.